Hello, BookTube. I have a discussion video today, just a quick thing, on a subject near and dear to my heart. Michael Deutsch recently made a video about what makes a classic. What makes a book a classic? He hauled out the definition and then started talking about different characteristics, and I couldn't. There have been good responses. Matilda Gothica did a response. Plots and Points did a response, and I couldn't let the subject go without making a response myself, especially since I've thought a lot about it. In the course of, obviously, you can see a huge chunk of my reading in my life has been classics, it seems to me that there are four characteristics that go into making a classic, and I wanted to just put them out there, just to give you food for thought for a little bit. And the first of those is fame, and that might seem unfair and random too, but nevertheless, we're not talking about what's fair or not fair. We're talking about what actually defines an item, what defines a category. And there's no such thing as an obscure classic. There's no such thing as a classic no one's heard of. So fame is an actual active element. And the second category that I want to talk about is kind of the thing on which the fame is based, which is accessibility. If you write a novel about an unfaithful wife, and you write it in the 19th century in French, hundreds of thousands of people can read it. And there are thousands of people among those hundreds of thousands of people who can easily translate it into, dozens of other languages. Whereas if in the mid-19th century, if you write an equally absorbing and insightful novel about an unfaithful wife in a Southern Cree dialect that only 200 people know and that only 2 people in the world can translate, you won't have accessibility, and so it won't matter, because you don't have the accessibility, you won't achieve the first characteristic of a classic, which is fame. And that's not a value judgment one way or another. It's just cruel. It's just the way it is. That's all. Which is why it's been my experience that most classics come from big multinational dominant cultures. Most classics are produced by pinnacle civilizations, and that's one of the reasons, is because they can tap into fame. They can tap into accessibility, but those things will only get you so far. At the heart of a classic is the third characteristic, and that's relatability. You can have all the fame in the world, you can have all the accessibility in the world, but if your book isn't relatable, if it doesn't speak to the widest possible spectrum of readers, then it won't become a classic, no matter how good it is. And there's, that you can see that going through literature all the way, to the very beginning. The grief that Gilgamesh feels at the death of his friend Enkidu is universal. And it doesn't, the culture, the world, the geography, everything about the world in which that story was originally carved down is gone. It's all changed. But those feelings are universal. Same thing with Aeschylus, or Sophocles or Euripides. Their characters are instantly emotionally relatable. The dilemmas that they face might be weird and exaggerated, but the emotions grip the reader right away. You have Orestes has the worst possible moral choice in the world. He's duty bound to avenge the death of his father, but one of the murderers of his father is his mother. That's a moral dilemma in which there is seemingly absolutely no way out, and of course there turns out to be no way out except Deus ex machina, or Antigone, who's trapped between filial piety, between family duty, and the inexorable machinery of the state. Who doesn't relate to that? Who can't immediately understand that? Or Oedipus, whose conflicts are completely internal. He is driven by two completely opposite and mutually destructive impulses. On the one hand, to retain the ignorance that allows him to have a comfortable, happy life, and on the other hand, to find out things, to know the truth of things. Those two things are in conflict. They cannot live together. And that speaks to readers, even now, after 2,000 years. And you can see it also in the present day, where you will find perhaps a less well-written book, where the main character is infinitely relatable, versus a far better written book in which there are no relatable characters. If that's true, the first book will always become the classic, and the second book will never become the classic, because it's an essential characteristic of the breed. So, for instance, readers have always found it extremely easy to relate to Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye. Even though Catcher in the Rye is not a particularly well done book. It's heresy to say, but nevertheless, it's true. Whereas, to take for instance a name that sometimes comes up in certain corners of BookTube, Muriel Spark is a divinely beautiful prose stylist who never wrote a relatable character in her life. And as a result, the novels of Muriel Spark, one by one, have gone away, whereas The Catcher in the Rye continues endlessly to be taught and read and appreciated and handed hand to hand. And you'll notice that the only brush that Muriel Spark has ever had with that kind of relatability happened when she was given a boost. It happened when The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie was made into a movie and given Maggie Smith. And all of a sudden, I mean, movies are of course intensely relatable. That's their whole reason for being. And that happened to that book. But even so, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie is likewise vanishing. And it's the movie only saved it by giving it a pulse. The character of Jean Brodie is not all that relatable in the book on the flat page. So you have to factor that in when you're thinking about classics, because, for instance, you have in the mid 19th century you have endless novels about the workers' plight, about the urban poor, and they aren't read. And they're completely forgotten, and they're dreadful. If you find one and read them, it's like having unanesthetized tooth surgery. Whereas Moby Dick is a classic, even though it's a ship entirely manned by men at sea, whaling, which goes to show you the strange alchemy of relatability. It is intensely emotionally relatable, even though only a fraction of the people in the America of its own day could directly, personally relate to any of the actual goings on in the novel, and no one can today. So relatability is key. It's not just a question of fame and accessibility. It's what you do when you get there. Do you speak to the reader? And if you do, then you will get the last quality that I want to talk about classics, the last defining characteristic, and that is, if you are famous and accessible and relatable, then you will survive. The last quality that defines a classic is time. And it's the reason why I always have very little patience with people who say, even though I've said it myself, every book reviewer has said it, that something is an instant classic or a modern classic. There is no way to know that. Unfortunately, that is for time alone to decide. So if anyone is alive still who knew the author, who was alive when the author was alive, then it's too soon to tell. You can guess. I've made guesses myself. I predicted for decades that the lumps of wetwash that John Updike was producing every year, and that were getting the whole literary world to sing his praises, did not have the grace of time, that they would not survive the author by very long. And I stand by that prediction. I think the same thing is also true of Philip Roth. I think the same thing is also true and is now being demonstrated by Norman Mailer. And despite the howls of protest that might happen at BookTube, I think the same thing is very obviously true of Stephen King. That once the author is no longer around to accept literary awards or make pungent public comments, once the cult of the living person has disbanded, the works will largely disband. I could be wrong. That's the neat thing about the time element of classics, is that anybody can be wrong. Time and the weird mysteries of relatability can honor a book that doesn't deserve it and keep it going. Just the same as the lack of those things can bury something that is technically very worthy. So I just I don't want to wool gather for too long. I just wanted to put those qualities in your mind, just to think of it, because I obviously, as you can see, I love reading classics, and I put a lot of thought into thinking about what makes one. And I believe it's those four qualities in an intermix, and that you need all four, and that you can't do without even one. But one of them, time, is of course kind of unknowable. So there is a shifting element of a sort of Heisenberg uncertainty thing going on with judging whether or not a book is a classic today, that's being written today, whose author is still alive. I find that fascinating. I find the whole subject fascinating, and I would love to hear. I mean, Michael ended his video the same way, and the response videos have been calling for it too. And one of the underground implications of this discussion is that classics kind of sort of aren't discussed enough on BookTube. And I agree with that. And Michael pointed at one of the reasons. I think he's absolutely right, which is that classics are given a bad name because students in high school are forced to read them. It puts a bad taste in your mouth. At a time when you are discovering what your relationship with reading will be, you are forced to read these things and regurgitate memorize points about them. That would put anybody off reading something. You couldn't devise a system better that deadens an awareness on the reader's part that these things are living texts, that they are wonderful living texts. You couldn't come up with a better way to disincline people to believe that than the way these things are taught in high schools and colleges today. But that's a rant for another time. But I would love to know what your own interactions with the classics are. I have seen booktubers whose whole face is scrunched up at the very mention of it. They very much are victims of that kind of anti-conditioning, and I want to know how many of you that's true for. Would you ever go back and pick up Victor Hugo or Shakespeare or something like that? Would you ever go back and do it? What would it take? What place in your mind do things like that occupy? And do you think there's any way that you could improve that space to maybe welcome them into your reading world if they're not there already? But that's enough wool gathering for now. I just wanted to chip in with this discussion, but I'll get back to my usual fare in no time at all. Thank you, BookTube.